Hello and welcome everybody. I'm really looking forward to presenting this information tonight. We have got a big subject and I think it's definitely something that all of us have been touched by at some point in time. Now, the information that we're presenting tonight is in some ways completely different to everything that you've heard before. And what we specialize in is looking at genetic susceptibility to anxiety and depression and actually seeing what we can do in terms of turning that around. So many of you that are here tonight will either have a loved one who is facing anxiety or depression, or maybe it's yourself. And so I hope the upshot of this is at the end of the night that you are giving strategies and you're given really good tips that you can walk away with to make a big difference. So I'm going to share my screen. First of all, I'll bring up my presentation and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all share my screen. You can see my screen and you can hear me fine. All right, so what are we talking about when we talk about mental health? And it is such a big topic that mental health issues mean different things to different people. And I think what COVID has certainly highlighted this year is that there's not one size fits all. Isolation has affected us, stress has affected us, and stress has affected us in many different ways. It's affected us in terms of our ability to provide food for our family. It's ability for us to pay our bills. It's the ability for us to socialize and actually have some human contact. And I think all of those has affected many people around the country. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Carolyn Ladowski and I'm the founder of MTHFR Support. And what we do from a clinical perspective is we look at your genetic susceptibility. We put on top of that what the environmental exposure may have been, because what we know from the research is that your genes are influenced by your environment. And when we talk about environment, we're talking about everything from the food you eat, the stress that you're affected by, the infections that you have, the lack of sleep that you get, the lack of exercise that you do. They are potential influences on your genes and can actually make genes switch on, which means they can express. And so when we look at an anxiety and depression, there's not great statistics. And these stats are 2007. 15% of Australians aged 16 to 85 will experience depression in their lifetime. That's a lot, but their stats, you know, their 2007 stats, they're really old. Now that's 1 in 7. I'd think that it's way higher now. And a quarter of Australians will experience an anxiety condition in their lifetime. And that's a staggering nearly 5 million people. And that again was 2007 stats. And a high proportion of the people that we see in the clinic suffer from anxiety and depression. And so these stats were put up on the television last night. They are the latest stats that we are seeing that's coming out of COVID. And this is particularly related to Victoria. 1 million people in Victoria were seeking treatment. In September and October, 350,000 Victorians sought help. 3,702 kids were ringing helpline. It's a 61% increase in the previous 4 weeks. And unfortunately, and very sadly, there's been a 33% spike in eating disorders, and that's across the board. And so what we've got to do is say, well, how can we influence this? What are the things that we can understand about ourselves and about the environment that could actually make a big difference? And so this whole picture is multifactorial, which means there's many things that contribute to it. But I firmly believe how you are genetically is what your susceptibility is, and by understanding your susceptibility, you can go a long way towards influencing either biochemically, nutritionally, food-wise, influencing how stress affects your body. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. And as we said, your genetic susceptibility may never be an issue. However, it's environmental factors that play on top of those genes that cause something to happen that you don't necessarily want to happen. So diet, gut, chronic infections, hormones, stress, and this year has been unbelievable from a stress perspective, and environmental toxins. And they're the key things. They're not the only things, but they're the key things that we're going to be talking about tonight. So if we understand a little bit more about our neurotransmitters and what they are and what they do, we can understand then how what neurotransmitters in us could be high or low depending on how we feel. So a good old tryptophan over here on the left is the precursor to 5-hydroxytryptophan that makes serotonin. Serotonin goes on to make melatonin. Now, serotonin is your feel-good, happy hormone. Usually when we feel sad or we get worse in winter than we are in summer, you can pretty well say it's a serotonin issue. Particularly if your sleep is affected. Tyrosine, on the other hand, which creates dopamine and then goes on to create norepinephrine and epinephrine, which is adrenaline and noradrenaline, this is different. Now, these people with this are usually those people who have suffered depression much of their lives, because essentially they have genetics that make them lose dopamine out of the body. And we're going to talk about this particular type a lot tonight, because I think this relates to many people in the current situation where they can't get out, they can't do things, they can't socialize, and this is actually affecting their mental health. These people just feel sad, and they feel sad particularly when it's not sunny, and they perhaps have gut issues that are causing a reduction in serotonin, but these people have a really big risk for depression, and usually lifelong. We also have glutamate that gets converted to GABA. So think of GABA as your nice, calming neurotransmitter that allows us to take that big breath and go, ah, that feels good. GABA calms us. Glutamate stimulates us, increases the anxiety. So glutamate is very, very involved in anxiety. And unfortunately, when we have gut stuff going on and we've got chronic infections, it's the glutamate to GABA balance that gets upset. And that's mostly related to anxiety, whereas these two are mostly related to depression. And choline is important for our brain. So if any of you can't remember names, you can't remember, or you can't add up, or you haven't got the ability to remember where you left your car in a car park or where you put your car keys, that means that your neurotransmitter, usually acetylcholine, is the problem, and phosphatidylcholine. They're the two brain fats that make your brain work. So you might already be saying, oh, that's me. And so what we're going to look at in a little bit more depth is, I want you to try and pick tonight what neurotransmitter do you think you're deficient in? And it's relatively easy without genetic testing to do this purely by the sort of questions I'm going to be asking you tonight. So we have two main genes, MAO-A and MAO-B, and you've probably heard of these. They're called monoamine oxidase A and B. MAO-A predominantly affects serotonin and dopamine, whereas MAO-B purely affects dopamine. COMT, and for those of you that are Ben Lynch followers or follow our work in detail, you'll know we talk about the COMT, catechol-O methyltransferase. We talk about this gene a lot, and it affects dopamine. So For those of you that have got depression, the chances are half of you are going to be a high dopamine type and half of you are going to be a low dopamine type. And depending on which one you are, you should be able to then have a seriously good influences on your depression just by understanding that. B12. So without B12, most people would have depression. B12 deficiency is endemic, and there's probably no one that comes into the clinic that has depression that I do not give B12. And sometimes that's the only thing we give because it has such a huge influence on your ability to make your neurotransmitters and shunt B12 to where it needs to go to. And the very nature of our business is called MTHFR Support because the MTHFR gene, we believe, is critical. It is the linchpin in a lot of this because it is what makes your active folate. And if you can't make active folate, you haven't got the starting ingredient for all your neurotransmitters. So they're probably the key things that we look at from a genetic point of view to say, well, do you have issues with any of these? And B12 is actually quite easy to pick up because you ask people, has anyone in your family ever had to have B12 shot? Often the answer is yes. And do you get any numbness, tingling, pins and needles, any problems with, any sort of peripheral issues with your fingers and numbness and tingling and things like that? So if we now have a really good deep dive into COMT. As we said, it controls the level of dopamine and therefore epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and noradrenaline. So it regulates our dopamine levels. Now, it's also important for detoxification of toxic estrogens. So many women, or I would actually say all women that have anxiety-related PMS, you have a problem with your COMT gene. You're not clearing toxic estrogens, and that is spiking a histamine reaction. These women can also get it at ovulation in the middle of the cycle, where they see this high anxiety. And so understanding that and dealing with that, a lot of the time, all that anxiety related to the menstrual cycle, it disappears. And I mean, it disappears. Within 3 to 4 months, that anxiety has gone. Women also with terrible period pains that cause them to go to bed, that will be gone within 3 to 6 months of addressing this toxic estrogen load. So essentially with this COMT enzyme, it means if the enzyme is fast, you're working too hard, it's processing your dopamine and you're bottoming out your bucket. If your enzyme is too slow, it's filling up, but there's nowhere for it to go. So the bucket overflows. So one is a low bucket of dopamine. The other one is an overflowing bucket of dopamine. And let me explain where, so this is an example of the sort of genes that we look at. But this is your dopamine pathway, and you can see how influential that COMT gene is. It's everywhere. It's helping you balance that level of dopamine. Now, serotonin, we said, remember, MAO-A was really important. Well, there's the MAO-A. It sits immediately after serotonin. So if you don't break it down, you get high serotonin. If this works too fast, you get low because you're losing it. And here's what I want you to look at and evaluate which one you fit into. So remember we said we had a slow COMT, which means you've got too much dopamine, your bucket is overflowing. So these are the A-type personalities. They are driven, they are focused. There is nothing that gets in their way to achieve their goals. They'll run over you if they have to achieve their goal. They start a course or they start a project and nothing Nothing. It doesn't matter what happens in their life, nothing will stop them doing it. They don't have an addictive personality. So it may seem like they do because they're so obsessed and focused. But if you put a block of chocolate in front of them, they may have one piece and they would let that block sit there for a month before maybe they picked up another piece. They might have one drink, but they would not have 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. They're highly self-motivated. They've got good feelings of self-worth. They are social, but if everything doesn't go to order, they get overwhelmed. And I guess being overwhelmed then increases their anxiety. So they're more likely to be anxious. And because they're so focused and so driven and they think well of themselves, they are susceptible to, criticism. They don't take it particularly well. Whereas if you are low dopamine, you're not motivated or self-driven. You rarely finish tasks. So you see these personalities that come in and they've had 5 or 6 courses, 5 or 6 jobs before they're 25. They never really stick with anything. There's a general lack of interest in life. It's the whatever attitude. It's the surfy, it's the surfy type behavior. Hey, I'll put that off. I'm going to go for a surf instead. Whatever. I don't care. I was meant to do that today. Whatever. But they are extremely prone to depression. And the depression is often lifelong. And so what they will do as a consequence is they will do anything to self-medicate to raise dopamine. So anything that raises your adrenaline will raise your dopamine. So you can see this down the bottom, these high performing jobs. So those people that don't necessarily get into the drugs and the sex and the rock and roll and the alcohol, they will do and usually have a job that raises adrenaline. Soldiers, what a great example. They don't have to be motivated because they're kicked in the butt. They are driven by somebody else every day of their life. But their very nature of their job is that they put their life on the line every day. And that is what gives them that adrenaline kick. That's what naturally raises the dopamine. As a rule, low dopamine types are very addictive personalities. And you can see it in families where you've got big drinkers being passed down the line. My grandfather was a big drinker, my father was an alcoholic, my mother was an alcoholic, and you can start to see these. Because what they're trying to do is make themselves feel better. So the more alcohol they drink, the more they go into the casino and lose the money and get that adrenaline going, the more they're going to keep doing it. The more cigarettes they smoke, the more drugs they take, the better they feel. And it's not because they're drug addicts, it's because they've got low dopamine and they try to do everything they can to raise levels of dopamine. And we see it all the time, and I've got a great case study to explain that to you tonight. As a general rule, the low dopamine type, they just get pissed off with everything. Everything ticks them off. You move something, you change something, you don't get something, they're just annoyed. Whereas the high dopamine, when they get annoyed, you know about it. It won't be about everything, but they do get angry, but they will show it and they'll probably explode. Whereas these poor low dopamine types, life pisses them off. It doesn't matter what they see, what they do, they just get ticked off about everything. And so you see generally very addictive personalities. They do risky behaviors. They might do rock climbing, or they might do paragliding, or they might be, a Navy diver, or they might be a shark hunter, or they'll do whatever it takes to get that adrenaline and that dopamine up. All those fast cars, you know, driving Formula One racing car, I bet they're all low dopamine, or generally probably 80 to 90% would be low dopamine. So you can start to see, and then if you say, well, I'm a little bit of each, you've probably got comped plus minus. So you've got a little bit of each, and that's probably the most balanced to be. You're not super addictive. You're probably a bit more focused, but you're not as focused as that high dopamine type. And when we talk about serotonin, this is, we tend to have, and you see the high serotonin less, because they are definitely high anxiety. You get psychosis, you get mania, you can get hallucinations and voices and really disturbed thinking. You can get diarrhea because serotonin regulates the bowels. You get rapid heart rate and tremors and excess sweating and agitation and restlessness, and in some cases, real OCD. And so being able to balance that serotonin and get it into the brain where it needs to be can make huge differences with these types. Whereas low serotonin, they're just sad. And they're particularly sad in wintertime. And I thought to myself, you know, we've just come out of a winter locked away where we couldn't go out, we couldn't do anything that we really wanted to do. And I'm sure that would have exacerbated a lot of low serotonin types, because they need the sunshine. They need to get out and feel good and have, you know, lovely sunshine and be able to do enjoy friendships and doing all of those things. But when the serotonin drops, they just get this loss of pleasure in hobbies or interests that they normally are interested in. They don't enjoy friendships or relationships anymore. They do have these feelings of inner rage and anger, but they're sad. They're sad and depressed. And they can become really obsessed by food because the things they're craving are carbohydrates, and it's the carbohydrates that raise serotonin. A lot of OCD with low serotonin, just as you get with high. But along with it, you get anxiety, panic attacks, bulimia, phobias, and you get eating disorders like anorexia. IBS, you get more constipation because, again, serotonin regulates the bowel, and you get insomnia because, remember, in that chart, we saw that serotonin was the precursor to melatonin. And so that's also really important to remember. So with that as a background, let's look at how the diet then can influence that. So I hope by now you're all thinking, well, that sounds a bit more like me, or I'm a combination of that and that. But you can start to see a bit of a picture, particularly those low dopamine types. That's really super important. Now, with diet, it's massive. If we're eating crap, we're going to get crap out. We need to fuel our brain, and we need to make sure that all those good amino acids we're getting from all that food, and it's not a chance that I put this graphic up. We need a good, broad, really well, what I would call a naturopathic diet. Obviously, we use selected dietary programs for selected patients at certain times in their life. But at the end of the day, we want that. We want this beautiful, total, good quality food much of the time. We don't want fads. And so here we see that there's a lot of dietary influences on mood and anxiety. Folate is absolutely key. We're going to talk about that. But oxalates, many people have an oxalate issue, and oxalates are becoming a bigger and bigger issue because so many foods are sprayed with Roundup and genetically modified foods that it's affecting our ability in our gut to break this down. And that affects our B6 and zinc. Without B6 and zinc, much of these brain chemicals just don't get converted the way that we want it to. Sulfur. So important, yet we've got so many people out there that are on a low sulfur diet. So onion, garlic, eggs, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, they're all high sulfur foods. But we need sulfur to be converting our serotonin and dopamine and getting it into the brain. High fructose corn syrup. So there's research coming out now with rats that's showing it will make them bipolar. And almost every single packet food that you buy on the supermarket shelf now has high fructose corn syrup in it. We have to be avoiding these things that are making us susceptible. B12, as we said, we're going to have a bit more of a deep dive into that. But B12 is incredibly important. Histamine. So if we have gut issues, chances are we've got an oxalate and a histamine issue. Histamine raises anxiety. So I've seen, we've worked with patients where we've got their estrogen under control, we've really reduced their histamine, and then they go back to a high histamine food a couple of months later because they think they're all fine, and anxiety spikes through the roof to the point where it goes from 1 out of 10 to 10 out of 10. If you have anxiety and you are drinking even 1 cup of coffee a day, that's 1 cup too much, because it is high in histamine and it will raise your histamine levels, which is a direct neurotransmitter to spike anxiety. Iron is also incredibly important because iron gets incorporated to a big gun, which is a cofactor called heme, and it's heme that really regulates our brain chemicals. It is the cofactor that allows us to convert our tryptophan to serotonin. Without that, we can't do it. Preservatives and flavorings, and you've probably heard many parents say, oh, if I give my son or daughter red food flavoring, they go crazy. And there's a lot that would influence it, and many of these are high glutamate foods, and we saw that glutamate should be converted to GABA, and without that we've got high anxiety. So lack of B12, one of the most important things, and this is the message that I hope we can get into schools, because I am so alarmed at the level of suicides in schools and school-aged children. When I grew up, we had one. By the time one girl in our whole of my school that committed suicide in her last year of school. However, my daughters had 6 friends each that they knew from the schools that they were mixing with that committed suicide, and many of them were young boys. I'm very, very alarmed at the new craze to go on plant-based diets. I'm even more alarmed that you get school groups convincing hundreds and hundreds of girls to go vegan and vegetarian. It is absolutely the worst thing that we can do. And when I look at patients that are coming in and they have gone vegan or vegetarian, I usually ask them, how long was it before you went on a vegan diet to when you fell sick and you didn't feel good? And they invariably say 18 months to 2 years. It takes time, but it happens, and it can be instantaneous when it does happen. So I think we have to counsel our kids that it is not good to be avoiding B12, which is essentially meat protein. We get it from meat. If you think you can get vitamin B12 from vegetables, think again. It doesn't happen. So unless they are having injections of vitamin B12 every single day, then forget it. You've got to, as adults and as parents, you've got to say, no, you're not doing that. And I would be happy to go to every single school in Australia to present this, because they've got to know about it. A lack of folate. So folate is a little bit more of a complicated story. Many of you will have an MTHFR polymorphism. That is your genetic susceptibility to not being able to make enough folate, good active folate. And remember, we said that good active folate goes on to make your neurotransmitters. But we've got another problem in that we fortify here and in the US and in other countries around the world, we fortify our foods by law, so all your bread and most of the packaged goods and all your breakfast cereals by law have to be fortified with folic acid. Folic acid is not an active folate. It is a synthetic folate. And there is emerging research, and I've delved into this a lot in my fertility work, in that if you have too much folic acid, and too much is only about 200 micrograms, it's not a lot, then the research says that a major enzyme that helps you metabolize your folate to the good stuff gets inhibited. And so I actually believe that this is one factor in why we have a rising rate in infertility, why we have more women having miscarriages, and why we've got way higher susceptibility to anxiety and depression in younger kids. Because you think about it, they get up and they have breakfast cereal fortified with folic acid. They take a sandwich to lunch and that is fortified with folic acid. They then have something out of a packet for afternoon tea, or they'll have some pasta for dinner fortified with folic acid. And then who knows, they may even take a folic acid based multivitamin or B vitamin. We're getting way too much, and that is actually affecting our good folate for our brain chemicals. That's a big, I want to say it's a big factor. I think it is a big factor. The research has not looked at this yet. And I think what we've got to be able to do, because I know from my clinical experience, if I take people off folic acid-based foods and I do nothing else, a lot of the time they can actually feel better. Gluten. There is research, and I presented this in my free gluten presentation that you can find on the website. It can induce schizophrenia in some people. If you have a genetic susceptibility to having a gluten, you don't have to be a celiac. Even to have a sensitivity to gluten, it can induce schizophrenia. So I think for any conditions where we've got anxiety and depression, three things that I would ask you to do. Don't go off meat, but make sure you're having good grass-fed meat 2 to 3 times a week. Make sure you're avoiding all folic acid and eat proper leafy greens to get yourself the good folate, and go off gluten. And just see if those 3 dietary factors help you feel better. As we said, high histamine foods, if you've got a genetic susceptibility or you've got high estrogen, that can be a problem. High fructose corn syrup, I've given you a link there, has been linked with bipolar disorder. Pesticides and herbicides, so they looked at South Americans because there's a huge subsection of the population there that are farmers, and they're crop dusting with glyphosate out of plains, and there's a huge huge spike in the rates of suicide and depression. So if you are living in a rural community, or you are exposed to any sort of toxins, or you're using glyphosate, or you're buying genetically modified foods, really think about changing that. And I've given you a link here to the environmentalworkinggroup.org. It's an international organization that looks at the quality of foods around the world, and they publish a list called the Dirty Dozen. And it's a list of foods that they say, no matter what, you just can't clean them. You're best to buy organic. So for example, bananas we can peel, oranges we can peel, avocados we can peel, but it's not very easy to wash a broccoli or cauliflower. So things like that, they say, listen, they're the ones you should buy organic. I mean, even strawberries, they are sprayed hugely, so are blueberries. So I think we've got to be looking at lists like that and say, well, I can't afford to do, all organic, but I really can't afford to do maybe these 12. And that's probably a very good start. And I think another factor is just the sheer lack of nutrients, that people aren't being balanced. So zinc and copper are incredibly important for our neurotransmitters. Without copper, you can't break down your dopamine. So even looking at your bloods and trying to get that balance in your nutrients is a really good place to start. And as I said before, fad diets. Look, we've got keto, we've got paleo, we've got all meat, we've got no meat, we've got low carb, high carb, plant-based. The list goes on and on. And sure, there'll be times in your life where you'll need to do that for a short term. But as I said before, we don't want to be doing that long term because we need the well-rounded nutrients for our mental health. And if we talk about B12 for a sec, you can see a lot of the signs and symptoms here are neurological. And many people, those, again, vegans, vegetarians, people over the age of 60, because we don't make as much B12 as we get older, anyone who's had gut, any sort of gut surgery or has Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, these are the people that we really need to be careful with because they're the ones that are more susceptible to having that low B12. But in my working with the genetics and look at it, I'm absolutely amazed how many people in Australia are homozygous, which means they've got 2 copies of the genes mutated that helps us shunt B12 into the cell. And these people, doesn't matter how much B12 you give them, it doesn't make a change to their mental health. The only way you can do it is by giving them injections. And it works really well and it works really quickly. This was a study that was done and it reported on mood disorder with mixed psychotic features due to a vitamin B12 deficiency in an adolescent. And this was a case report. And what they found that his chief complaints were irritability, regressive behavior, apathy, crying, and truancy. He was diagnosed with a mood disorder with mixed psychotic features due to a vitamin B12 deficiency and only a very low dose. We use higher doses than this, but 500 micrograms a day completely turned it around. It says a visit on the 2nd week revealed no psychotic features. And that's 2 weeks worth. And that's how quickly it can turn around. If we talk about folate, and I don't want to spend a lot of time because many of you have heard this before, but folic acid is up here. This is our folate pathway. The whole objective of our folate pathway is to make this guy down here, 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. That's our active folate. And what it does is it goes on with the help of B12, and that's why B12 is so important, to make something really important called SAM, S-adenosyl methionine. And that is what helps you regulate your mood. And without this folate cycle working, you don't have the starting ingredient. If you have got a block here, and this is the enzyme that gets slowed or blocked by folic acid, this one here, and it builds up. It just does not pass the folate down the pathway so you can make this. If you have an MTHFR polymorphism, you're even struggling more because you've got a down regulation of that enzyme on top of having a problem up here. So we really need to think about, do you have an MTHFR polymorphism? And don't forget, and we'll talk about stress in a bit, that's one of the major factors. Here's a paper that looked at B vitamins and behavior and showed that there was evidence of associations with neurodevelopment, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, and cognitive decline, particularly in those with MTHFR, and this transcobalamin is the B12. So without these working effectively, we are very susceptible to depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc. This one looked at natural food folate and late life depression. And it says these findings may indicate that the naturally occurring form of folate is uniquely protective for depression and perhaps brain health. Alternatively, natural folate may be a surrogate for other nutrients or overall dietary quality. So they actually found that if you get your leafy green veggies as opposed to folic acid, you are better off. And some of you that have the MTHFR polymorphism, you probably couldn't eat enough leafy green vegetables to jump over that. And that's where the methylfolate becomes really important. They said in that study, our finding of an inverse association between natural folate intake and depression is consistent with previous studies. So the higher the folate, the lower the depression. A Finnish study of 2,313 middle-aged men found that participants who consumed less than the median folate intake at baseline had a 3 times greater risk of being hospitalized for depression. It goes on to say folic acid fortification has resulted in a mean increase in folic uptake that is approximately twice as large as we previously projected. They didn't think that the levels would get that high. Unmetabolized folic acid has been detected in 78% of postmenopausal women, an anomaly which has been linked to reduced natural killer cells. So particularly in COVID, that's what helps your immune function, and may impair the normal functioning of natural folate. In terms of brain health, folic acid may interfere with transport of folate across the blood-brain barrier because it blocks receptors. And you know why? Because the good folate, the methylfolate, is the only form of folate to cross the blood-brain barrier. So if you're blocking that good folate, you've got no folate to get into the brain. This one looked at L-methylfolate as an adjunctive therapy for SSRI. SSRI is an antidepressant, resistant major depression. And it said it's actually a really good thing to use. You can see it crosses the blood-brain barrier. But it said it's an effective, safe, and relatively well-tolerated treatment for patients with major depressive order. So as we said, if you're given an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, but you have a problem with dopamine, that isn't going to work. That SSRI is going to do nothing for you. So what we look at and what we guide a lot of the medical practitioners that I mentor is giving them the strategy to be able to assess someone with depression and say, well, are you a serotonin or are you a dopamine type? And then we find that those people who have some good results with their antidepressant, but it doesn't work enough, then we supplement them with the methylfolate as an adjunct, and it works really well. The gut-brain, and I'm sure you've all heard the gut-brain connection. It's massive, it's everywhere. Everybody talks about it, but it's a two-way thing. Your brain affects your gut and your gut affects your brain. The brain controls the movement of food through the intestines, and stress, and we're going to talk about stress, but stress, the natural reaction with a stress response is that the body says, I don't need things that I don't need now when I'm trying to kill a bear. I'm going to down-regulate everything that's not important. Making good hydrochloric acid for your gut, that's not important when you're about to kill a bear. Storing, pumping glucose through your body is, because you need that for your energy. Your hormones don't matter. And so in a natural stress response, this is meant to be an acute phase. And within hours, it goes back to normal. But when you have chronic stress for a long period of time, all these things that we need you to work with, that we need to work for your biochemistry, they get down-regulated. So hydrochloric acid in the gut goes down, which means you don't absorb your B12 and you don't break your amino acids down. You store more fat, you release more sugar. Your brain then gets this surge of anxiety every time you get a sugar dip, and you end up in this spike of, every 1.5, 2 hours, anxiety up, anxiety down, anxiety up, and it relates to food because that stress pumps cortisol, and it will just, if you ever get that butterfly feeling in the stomach, So let's say you're about to get up and give a presentation in front of 5,000 people. You know that terrible butterfly feeling and you feel, oh my God, I'm going to be sick. Well, if you get that on a daily basis, that is a sign that you are pumping cortisol around your body. And all the things that you need your body to do in terms of gut and hormones and neurotransmitters, it gets put on hold because the body says you're about to fight a bear. That's way more important. You don't need good hormones when you're fighting a bear. So if you're getting that feeling, you've got to get that under control because that is making everything so much worse. And even if you have problems with bugs, candida, clostridia, you may not even have any real gut symptoms, but it's worth doing a stool test because you could have bugs there that is changing your ability to make serotonin. The changes in the mycology of the gut will change neurotransmitters. So it can reduce serotonin and increase dopamine. So even without genetic susceptibilities in these things, you can get a big reduction in serotonin just because your gut isn't working. And if you've got yeast and clostridia, you can't break your dopamine down because the enzyme that helps you break dopamine down is being inhibited by yeast and clostridia. That way, we don't get to use our good folate. We don't have enough SAMe. We've got too much dopamine, which is giving us anxiety. We've got low serotonin, which is making us sad and depressed. So gut is absolutely critical. Now, I thought I'd just show you this case study, which is a really good example of the sort of cases that we deal with on a daily basis. So she's a 28-year-old female. She comes to the clinic with her mother and she's suicidal. Mind you, she is under the care of a psychiatrist. She is on medication, but all of these symptoms, she's still on medication. Her anxiety is 10 out of 10. She's having panic attacks every single day. She's got gut issues. She's got nausea, bloating, constipation, that sick feeling in the gut, the butterfly feeling. She had that all day, every day. She had joint and muscle pain, fatigue and brain fog. Can't get through the day due to the anxiety, and she can't sleep without an additional sleeping pill. So the poor girl is in a state of panic. Yes, she's a little bit depressed. Well, she's actually suicidal. She's more than a little bit depressed. But she physically can't get through the day because her anxiety is so high. She's like a deer stuck in the headlights. So what did we do? The very first thing we did is we gave her a cortisol reducing supplement to reduce that pumping of cortisol, because that has a really big influence on her on her anxiety, excuse me. And we gave her key supplements just to calm her. We put some zinc in because we found her zinc was really low, and we gave her 5-hydroxytryptophan, which helps with serotonin. We gave her a bit of digestive support because we knew that the hydrochloric acid was low because she'd been in this stress response for such a long time. And we gave her some B12 injections and referred her for a stool test. One week, she was not suicidal and her mood had gone from 0 to 10. 1 week. Anxiety was not 10 out of 10, it was 5 out of 10. So we'd reduced the anxiety by half. We got results of an organic acids test and she had a lot of gut stuff going on. So high clostridia, which stops her breaking down a dopamine, high yeast, which stops her breaking down the dopamine, actually puts her dopamine and serotonin in the opposite. So no wonder her serotonin was low. She had a lot of low digestive enzymes and she was very low in B6 niacin and her B vitamins. So we continued to see her. We gave her gut protocol to deal with the yeast and clostridia. We added in magnesium. We balanced all of her low nutrients. And she's actually really good. 1 month later, her mood was good and stable. Her anxiety was 3 out of 10. Sleep was still an issue because sleep is just that much harder to get back to normal when you've been in that state of anxiety and depression for such a long time. And also she was on sleeping pills. So it takes a long time to be able to get someone to sleep again and to get them off those sleeping tablets. And we continue to see her, but it's very rare now. I was seeing her every 2 days. Now I probably see her twice a year. She understands now. We've counseled her in how to help get her to deal with the stress, which is really good because she's now able to manage this 90% on her own. And if she can't and something happens, then we're there. If we look at, if we talk about stress, and I think this is so relevant now because of what we've all been through this year. And I don't think we can really I don't think we can be too careful, and we can't underestimate what this year has done to everybody. And whether it's emotional stress or financial stress, it's still a stress. And stress is probably the #1 thing that upsets the balance between our ability to cope and not, because it's chewing up those methyl groups and the active folate. And so if we've got a susceptibility to being able to make it, the more stressed we are, the bigger the hole in the bucket, the harder it is for us to get out of it. And it's probably the #1 question I get asked is, I've obviously had this gene issue my whole life, but why? Why does it now affect me? And the answer is always, there's been some sort of stress that has caused this to happen. And if we talk about physical stress for a moment, I did have, I actually worked with Ian Thorpe's management many years ago. And, you know, I used to, when I found out that later on, many years later, he was affected by mental health, along with Grant Hackett and a lot of these that you can see here on this sheet. They're elite athletes. They're pushing their bodies to the limit. They're stressing their body every single day. It's like it's anyone who has that work that does that. They're putting the line, the soldiers, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the divers, they're putting their life on the line every day. These guys are not necessarily doing that, but they are pushing their body to the limit. We know that, you know, all these elite triathletes and everything else, they get sick all the time because they just haven't got the ability to back up. And this is what I think we're seeing with these elite athletes, is they're pushing their bodies to the limit, but they may not have the capacity to back up. And what they should do, and what we teach our patients, is to preload. You know you're going to go into a stressful thing, you preload on your methyls, you preload on your nutrients, so you take the effect off the body. You're not allowing that stress to take hold. And emotional stress. Stress stimulates inflammatory and immune activation genes. Chronic stress upregulates the cortisol response. So as we said, we get low hydrochloric acid, we get altered gut function, we get more gain of weight around the middle, we're more sensitive to blood sugar. But chronic stress, more than anything, depletes the key methylation nutrients that we need to keep our brain and our mental health good, like the B12 and the folate and the SAMe. There's been studies with patients with MTHFR, and they've looked at childhood trauma, and having a physical or a mental childhood trauma can cause their genes to express and trigger lifelong anxiety and depression. Same with spousal abuse, can actually activate these genes and cause a knock-on effect. So it's not ridiculous to think that the isolation that we've all been going through, and particularly we've got to feel for those people who are on their own, that's a huge stress. That's massive. The financial and the job losses and the not knowing where the next meal is going to come from or where you can pay your rent. That's a stress that we've never had to deal with before. And it hasn't been 1 or 2 weeks. It's been going on since the 20th of March. That is a long time. So what we've got to do is we've got to get ourselves back to baseline. And we do that through our diets and through the nutrients that get us back to baseline. We need to understand, well, where is my genetic susceptibility and how can I help myself get out of this? And that's essentially what we do every day. And so this physical, this mental, it's because our methyls are being used up. We're not replacing them because we don't have the capacity to. And stress uses up all these proteins that we need for our brain function. Zinc, folate, as we said. So we wonder, you know, how many of those elite athletes actually did have the MTHFR gene? I'd love to look at that and see. So here's another case study, and I think this is more of your low dopamine type. So this is a 40-year-old male that I saw about 1.5 years ago. Depression since 13 years of age, and he says no trigger. Now, when you see depression at 13, no 13-year-old should be depressed. There's something going wrong. It's either emotional, it's physical, or it's genetic, or it's a combination of all three. He's been on meds since he was 30. So for 10 years, he's been on meds, he's been on antidepressants, but he says they don't really work. He's tried multiple antidepressants and they don't really work. None of them has really worked. He was on Pristique when I saw him, which is an SNRI, not an SSRI. It works slightly differently. He said it sort of works, but he's still got all of these symptoms. Very up and down, anxiety through the roof, unmotivated, irritable, suicidal at times, drugs and alcohol get him by. He was drinking up to 14 beers a day, sometimes more on weekends, and he sleeps a lot. He doesn't want to go to work. He doesn't want to get out of bed. He doesn't want to go to bed. He doesn't really want to do anything, and he's pissed off all the time. He's a farmer, so he's exposed to Roundup and sprays. He said, alarmingly, he sometimes vomits after he comes back in after using it. I thought, holy hell, like, my God, this is bad. He smokes around 15 cigarettes a day, bad energy, gut pain, diarrhea pretty much of the day, tingling, numbness, pain, shaking. But he's a thrill seeker. He loves hang gliding, loves windsurfing, loves doing risky things. Is that a low dopamine type? Is that it to a T? Yes, it is. They're the sort of people that we go, you're low dopamine, no wonder you're depressed. So how can we help you? So what we did, breakfast, that's the other thing. He doesn't have breakfast because he can't be bothered. He doesn't have much lunch either. If he's lucky, he might have a white roll with some ham and cheese. There, he's got his crappy folate in there. The only meal he really has, which is any good, is his protein and veggies at night, and that's because his partner makes it. But he said to me at the first appointment, I don't have lunch really because I drink beer. It's the only way I can calm my nerves and I can get through the day. But a lot of people are like that. It's not because they're addicts, it's because they are desperately trying to self-medicate. It is the only thing that makes them feel good. And so I saw him first in July, and we gave him dopamine raising supplements at breakfast and at lunch. We gave him B12 injections, some B vitamins, magnesium, and we said, eat. You can't have any energy, you can't have good mental health if you're not eating. So you've got to eat. You've really got to make that effort to eat. So 2 weeks later, I said, has your partner noticed anything? He said, yes. She actually says that I'm more pleasant to be around because he's not pissed off all the time. He said, I do seem to be getting through a lot more in a day. So I think my motivation is much better. And he really, really made a concerted effort to eat lunch every day. He's still got the shakes, and the shakes is part and parcel of that sort of low dopamine, because remember, Parkinson's disease is a problem with dopamine. And so you will often see the shaking as one of the first signs of, you know, a bit of a dopamine issue. His mood was actually 6 to 7 out of 10. That was pretty good after 2 weeks. He said, I'm feeling pretty good. His gut pain had gone, and so it is diarrhea, because I told him to stop eating chili. Chili is high in histamine. It causes contraction of smooth muscle. It causes him to go to the toilet and get the cramping. His energy, it was still mediocre, but it was a little bit better than it was. So we added folate, zinc, and glutathione. 1 month later, he said, my God, my depression is so much better. He said, I could go so far as to say it's probably nearly gone. He said, I feel like I've got my life back. I feel like I'm back in control. And unbelievably, he cut out all his soft drinks and he cut out all his beer, because I said he had to cut down. And it's no point in me saying you've got to cut all the alcohol out. It's not going to happen overnight. But he did a really good job at reducing those 14 beers to 4 glasses of wine at night. And he even later on said, I don't do it every night now. And I might drink a few more on the weekends, but I'm really trying to keep it maximum 4. And I was really happy with that. He's eating lunch and dinner. His energy, and look, you can see after a month, it had come up so much more. It was 8 out of 10 because he was eating. He was getting some protein. His sleep had improved significantly, and instead of taking an hour and a half to fall asleep, he was falling asleep pretty quickly, and his anxiety had gone. So you can see that if you get the right balance and you understand where the deficiency is, you can work around that to plug it up. Think of it like this. Let's say you're driving down a freeway and you've got an old car and you've got lots of potholes. Then it doesn't really matter what you do to the car. It's going to be trashed. An old car, new car, medium car, it's going to be trashed because you're going to lose your wheels, you're going to break your suspension. But let's say you've got an old or a new car and you plug up those potholes, you're going to toot along quite well, irrespective. You know, eventually the old car will give it in, but generally it'll run along quite smoothly. And that's how I see your genetic susceptibility. It's you've got potholes and we've got to plug them up so you run along quite smoothly. And what we've got to understand is, for those of you that are on the pharmaceuticals and the antidepressants, is, are you on the right one? Should we be combining that with your folate, your active folate? You all should be taking folic acid out of your diet. You need to understand, have you got a serotonin problem or have you got a dopamine problem? If you've got a dopamine problem, no amounts of serotonin pharmaceuticals is going to help you. You need something that's going to raise your dopamine. And I prefer you do it naturally, but if you have to do that pharmaceutically, I'm fine with that. But I'm going to give you methylfolate at the same time. So for those of you that do have anxiety, here's a little bit of a test I want you to do. And after this, you're actually going to get an email with the link to the niacin. But I want you to take 200 milligrams of niacin, and I want you to do it every 2 hours for as long as it takes you to feel better. Now, you may not feel 100% better, but you may feel 70% better. And if the answer is yes, I do feel better, then it means you've got a block in your folate pathway and you've got to find out what it is. Is it yeast? Is it mold? Is it stress? Is it blood sugar? What is it that's causing that block? If you have depression and you feel worse, then it means that you don't have enough folate. We don't normally do this test for depression. We do it for anxiety. So if your anxiety comes off, let's say you've got muscle aches and pains, you've got headaches, you've got high anxiety, you can't sleep, try that test. And we'd love to hear from you, love to see how it worked, but 9 times out of 10, it'll work. And it can mean that you're not the same people who have tried methylfolate and they can't take it because they feel worse. You have a block. You have a block in this pathway and you've got to unblock it. I think B12, as I said, sometimes it is the only thing that you need to make you feel better, particularly if you're one of those people that has a double mutation in the B12 carrying genes. That's really important. If we gave you B12, chances are your depression would go if you have that particular gene. And definitely making sure you're getting the good folate is where you need to be. Okay, so we're nearly at the end. Diet is key. Folate, not folic acid. B12, be avoiding as much as you possibly can the pesticides, herbicides, colouring, gluten, at least until you feel better. And if you then feel that the gluten isn't an issue and you want to start putting it back in and test what the reaction is, then do that. But to start, if you've got anxiety and depression, take it out. See if it makes a difference, particularly if you've got gut issues. And if you've got gut issues, you've got to fix them because it has such a huge influence on your mood. Exercise. So I think this has been one of the biggest issues. We can't exercise and do what we normally do. Here in New South Wales, we've been very lucky. We haven't been shut down for as long as you, particularly in Victoria. It's been horrific. And I think, you know, being able to get out and exercise and get in the sun is so important. And socialization, even if it is online, is absolutely critically important. And if you don't have anyone to talk to, join a Facebook group, join any sort of group to give you that interaction that you need. So we will send you this information. We do have an anxiety and depression course starting in a few weeks, and it is to do this. It is to help you work through this minefield of diet, gut, etc. So if you feel like you need the support, I would really highly recommend you have a look at this. All the details will be emailed to you. It's got we have real actionable steps that you can take. So we've got a few moments for some questions. If you want to pop some questions in. John, yes, I will definitely, what I will do is send the PDF to Neve tonight, and I will ask her to send it to you. And I'm pretty sure she'll be able to include that in the email that she sends out to you tonight. No problem. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, John. Anyone else have any questions before you go? Anything that maybe it's a comment. You don't need to put in a question. Maybe we've got something in the chat box. This is from Rhonda. Hi, I am COMT++ and MAO-A++. Aha. Well, remember we said MAO-A affects dopamine and serotonin. So you have more of a dopamine issue, and in that it's high and potentially a low serotonin. So I would say by looking at that, you probably relate to that high dopamine driven A-type personality. If I was to pick, I mean, I haven't ever spoken to you. Faye, the zinc that we recommend is a picolinate. We have a zinc picolinate on our website. which you can take. We believe that the zinc picolinate is much, much better for neurological support than, say, a bisglycinate or what we have available. So I would recommend a picolinate because it just seems to work so much better. All right, Deborah, if the niacin test makes no difference, what do you conclude? Then I conclude that you don't have a block, but you definitely have low folate. And that's what we would work on, the folate component. So if what the niacin does is it actually mops up excess methyl groups that you're not dealing with. And just that in itself can cause huge amounts of anxiety. So if the niacin makes no difference, then you don't have a block necessarily, because mopping up those methyls didn't make you feel better. So then what we would say is you probably need the B vitamin support and probably B12 first. Does that make sense? So that's probably what I would say there. Are medical schools introducing this type of information into their curriculum, particularly in psychiatry? Kirsty, it's a really, really good question. And I find that overwhelmingly when I talk to doctors and specialists, except for the integrative doctors, if I start talking about this deep level biochemistry, they don't know it. They haven't been taught it. Because think about what is medicine now and what is psychiatry. It's mainly drugs, unfortunately. And now I think that's very much a reflection of the system itself, because if you've got 15 minutes to turn around someone's depression, you've got 15 minutes, we spend an hour and a half with each first patient. So if you've got 15 minutes, what are you going to do? All you can do is give a pill. Here's a pill. If you're not better, come back in a week's time and I'll give you a referral to a psychiatrist. I have had psychiatrists approach me. I think this would be amazing information, because at the end of the day, the GP and the psychiatrist, they're way before us. We're usually a last resort. We need these frontline doctors, GPs, psychiatrists understanding this so they can better use the drugs if that's what they want to use. Because think of all those people that have a dopamine-based depression that are given SSRIs. How many could we actually improve if we were giving them the right drugs? What if what if the blood test B12 is high? Normally, if it's high unsupplemented, you're not absorbing it. And that's a really big indication you could have this polymorphism in the transport of B12. So if you're not taking B12 and it's high, you're not using it, and that means you have a problem. So good question, Linda. That is, yeah, usually the case. All right, well, it was, what type of blood test is used to test B12? Well, there's a few. We have serum B12, we have methylmalonic acid, we have active B12, which is called holotranscobalamin. And what we should be doing is putting it all together and saying, is there a problem with B12? But I tend to go, I look at the genes, I go on the symptoms, and I say, you have a B12 problem. I'm going to go on your symptoms. I'm not going to worry about the B12 test, because I've done enough research around particularly hydroxycobalamin, which is a form of B12, and we've looked at what the research says about toxicity levels. And there's copious research studies that say you can use 50,000 micrograms a day for months to years with no adverse effects. So I'm not worried about the toxicity of hydroxycobalamin. I'm worried about potential irreversible neurological damage due to a low B12. So for me, B12 is always my starting place, because it is so critically important to anxiety and depression. It is probably one of the key nutrients. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this today. I think it's something that we really need to teach people to be aware of this, so that when you need support, or you need to find a practitioner, or you want to address this yourself, you've actually got the tools to do it, at least the starting tools to do it. So thank you so much. I really look forward to seeing you soon, and I'll say goodbye for now.